They said he was too cold to care for anything, until the girl arrived with nothing but a baby on the way and a price on her head. This is what happened to the rancher who didn't speak much, but ended up loving a child the world didn't want like it was his own. Please subscribe to the Quiet Rancher Stories channel, so this story can reach more folks who believe family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who you fight to protect. The air at the trading post was thick with the smell of wet earth and unwashed men. It was a muddy affair, always. Men milled about, voices rough from whiskey and shouting bids on livestock. Ezekiel Kane, a man of 42 winters, mostly kept to himself, moving through the crowd with the slow, deliberate stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He was there for cattle feed, the good stuff, the kind that cost more but kept the herd strong through the lean months. He had his list, his cash, and very little interest in the usual chatter. He was tying off a sack of dried alfalfa to his wagon when he heard it. Not a shout, not a bid, but a whine. A boy's whine, young and sharp, cutting through the general din. Ezekiel paused, his hand still on the rope. The voice was close, just past a stack of worn saddles. "Anyone? Anyone at all?" the boy said. "Got her right here. 18. Strong as an ox, mostly. Just damaged goods, you know." Ezekiel straightened. He moved around the saddles and saw them. A boy, no older than 20, thin and too eager, with a gap in his teeth, and beside him, a girl. She was young, maybe 18, like the boy had said. Her dress was coated in mud, her hair matted, but her eyes were fixed on the dirt, silent. She clutched a threadbare shawl to her front, and it wasn't hard to see the slight swell beneath it. A child. The brother laughed, a wet, rattling sound. Some town boy took off, left her with a souvenir. "My ma says she's no good now. Figured someone here might take her off my hands, you know, for the labor. She can cook, clean, she's a good worker." He looked around, hopeful, desperate. The other men glanced, then looked away. A pregnant girl was trouble, even out here. No one wanted that kind of burden. Ezekiel watched. The girl didn't move, didn't make a sound. Her jaw was tight, though, a small muscle jumping just beneath her ear. He looked at the boy, then at the girl again. He thought about the empty house on his ranch, the quiet that settled in the evenings, too heavy sometimes. He thought about the hard winter coming, and how a girl like that wouldn't make it on her own, not with a baby due. He reached into his coat pocket. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just walked over, laid a handful of silver coins and a few crumpled bills on the boy's outstretched palm. "She comes with me," he said, his voice flat, final. The boy's eyes went wide, then narrowed, but he took the money. He backed away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving the girl standing there, alone. The wagon creaked and swayed, the only sounds for a long stretch of road. Ruthie sat on a feed sack, her back rigid, facing forward. Ezekiel drove, his hands steady on the reins, his gaze on the horizon. He didn't look at her, not directly. He'd offered her the seat beside him on the bench, but she'd shaken her head, moving to the sacks without a word. He understood. It was easier that way. For both of them, maybe. He pulled a canteen from beneath the seat. The sun was hot, even for October. "Water," he grunted, holding it out. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to his hand, then back to the road. Her fingers, when she finally reached for the canteen, were thin and trembled just a little. She took a long, slow drink, her throat working. He saw the dust on her cheek, the way her hair clung to her temples. But her stare, when she met his eyes for a brief second, was strong. Resigned, maybe, but not broken. They rode like that for hours. The familiar turns of the road, the dusty fields, the distant silhouette of the mountains growing larger. The ranch house appeared first, a low, solid shape against the darkening sky. He pulled the wagon up to the porch, the horses snorting as they came to a stop. Ruthie didn't move. She just sat there, still on the feed sack, her hands clasped over her belly. He got down, unhitched the team. "Guest room," he said, nodding towards the door on the far side of the house, the one with the lace curtains that no one ever looked through. She didn't move for another minute, just stared at the porch, at the sturdy wooden door. He saw her shoulders slump, just a fraction. No one had ever invited her inside before, not like this. People had used her, certainly, blamed her, sold her, yes, but invited her, offered a room, a place inside the walls of a home. She looked at the door again, then at him. He was already leading the horses towards the barn. She slid off the wagon, her movements slow, careful. She walked toward the guest room door, paused, then pushed it open. He heard the soft click as it closed behind her. The kitchen was warm with the scent of beef stew and fresh bread. Ezekiel had cooked, as he always did, quietly, efficiently. He was setting the table, placing the tin plates and chipped mugs, when Ruthie appeared in the doorway. She moved with a surprising quietness for someone her size. Without being asked, she walked to the cabinet and pulled out 2 forks, 2 knives, and laid them beside the plates. She had washed, her hair damp and pulled back from her face. She still wore the same dirty dress, but now it was damp where she'd scrubbed at the stains. They ate in silence for a while. The stew was thick, the meat tender. Ruthie ate slowly, taking small bites, her eyes darting around the room, taking everything in. She didn't look at him much, but he could feel her watching, assessing. He didn't mind. It was better than the quiet, sometimes. Finally, she put her spoon down. It made a small clatter against the tin plate. "Why'd you take me?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper. It was the first question she'd asked, the first real words she'd spoken to him. He swallowed a mouthful of stew, thinking. He didn't have a good answer, not one that sounded right out loud. It wasn't pity, not exactly, more like an instinct. "A man doesn't watch a dog get kicked," he said, finally, his voice rougher than he intended, "and just walk on by." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He picked up his spoon, continued eating. She didn't press him. She just nodded slowly, looking down at her plate. Later that night, long after the dishes were washed and put away, he found her sitting by the dying embers of the fire in the living room. She was on the floor, leaning against the cold stone of the hearth, staring at the glowing coals. The room was dark save for the faint orange light. She had her hand placed gently on her belly, a small protective gesture. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. The quiet of the house wasn't quite so heavy anymore. He went to bed without another word, leaving her to her thoughts, to the slow, steady warmth of the fire. A week settled into a rhythm, the early morning chill, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the quiet routine of the ranch. Ruthie had started to move around the house with purpose. She cleaned the small parlor, swept the porch, even managed to stitch up a tear in an old canvas coat he'd left on a chair. She spent hours in the garden, turning the soil, weeding the dry beds, preparing for the spring that was still months away. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. She just worked, steadily, quietly. He found her reliable, surprisingly so. One morning, she was scrubbing the kitchen floor, kneeling on a damp rag, her movements slow but deliberate. He was at the stove, pouring himself another cup of coffee, watching the steam rise. The sun was just starting to cut through the window, painting a pale stripe across the floorboards. She paused, her hand still holding the brush. Her eyes went wide. She put her other hand to her belly, her fingers pressing lightly, then firmer. A small involuntary gasp escaped her lips. He watched her, frozen. The baby. He hadn't thought much about it, not really. It was a distant thing, a future event. But now, seeing her hands, the way her body tensed, he realized it was real, very real. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment she looked surprised, maybe even a little scared. Then, slowly, a faint smile touched her lips. It was small, fragile, but it was there. She touched her belly again, lightly, a silent acknowledgement. It was the first soft moment between them. No words, no questions, just a shared quiet understanding. The coffee suddenly tasted stronger. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. He didn't know what else to do. He just stood there, holding his mug, the steam warming his face, watching the girl on the floor, a quiet smile on her face, her hand resting over the life that was growing inside her. The air in the kitchen seemed to lighten, just a little. Word travelled faster than dust in a windstorm. The brother, he found out later, had been quite proud of his transaction. He'd bragged in the saloon, to anyone who would listen, that old Zeke took the trash in. Ezekiel heard whispers at the feed store. "That ain't his kid," someone muttered, loud enough for him to hear over the rustle of sacks. Another man chuckled. "He's too old anyway, wouldn't know what to do with a woman, let alone a baby." They followed him out, those whispers, clinging to his coat like burrs. He ignored them. He always did. He bought his feed, paid his due, and left. He didn't owe them an explanation for anything he did on his own land. But the whispers, small and mean, found their way back to the ranch, even though he never repeated them. Ruthie was sitting on the porch, mending a tear in one of his work shirts, when he rode in. Her fingers moved deftly, weaving the thread, but her eyes were shadowed. She watched him dismount, unsaddle his horse. He could feel her gaze on him, heavy with an unspoken question. He uncinched the saddle, placed it on the rail. He heard her sigh, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. "You regret it?" she asked, her voice low, barely audible above the jingle of the harness. He stopped, his hands still on the bridle. He thought about the men in town, their sneering faces, the words they threw around like loose stones. He thought about the quiet house, the smell of the bread she baked, the careful way she moved about, trying to be no trouble. He didn't answer her directly. He didn't need to. He walked past her to the old peach tree by the well. It was late in the season, but a few ripe peaches still clung to the branches, heavy and sweet-smelling. He reached up, plucked one, its skin warm from the sun. He turned, walked back to the porch and handed it to her. She looked at the fruit, then at him, her eyes wide. She took it, slowly. The unspoken answer hung in the air between them, clear as the afternoon sun. No, he did not regret it. The blizzard hit hard, a sudden brutal fist to the face of the ranch. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the windows, rattling the old house down to its foundations. Snow piled against the doors, drifts rising higher than the fence posts. The roof, old and weary, finally gave out in one spot, a slow, insistent drip near the fireplace. Ezekiel had put buckets down, but the thought of the storm, the cold, gnawed at him. He was checking the latches on the barn door, the wind tearing at his coat, when he saw her, Ruthie. She was shivering, wrapped in a thin blanket, her breath pluming in white clouds. She was checking on the goats, making sure they were safe, that the wind hadn't found its way through a crack in the wall. Her face was pale, pinched with cold. He felt a sudden sharp tightening in his chest. He didn't say anything. He just pulled off his own heavy wool coat, the one he'd worn through countless winters, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was too big, swallowing her thin frame, but it was warm. She looked up at him, her teeth chattering slightly. "The goats," she managed to say. "They're fine." He nodded, then took her arm, guiding her back through the swirling snow towards the faint light of the house. They sat by the stove, the fire a comforting roar against the storm's fury. The kettle simmered, sending up a thin plume of steam. She held a mug of hot tea in her gloved hands, still wrapped in his coat. He watched the flames, listening to the wind outside. The leak dripped steadily, a small rhythmic sound in the otherwise violent world. "When the time comes," he said, his voice quiet, "we'll handle it." He didn't specify what it was or who we meant. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, at the quiet determination in her eyes, despite the shivers. She didn't ask. She just nodded, her gaze steady, taking in his words, letting them settle between them like the warmth from the fire. The storm raged, but inside, a quiet resolve had begun to form. Spring came, slow and muddy. The snow melted into wide brown rivers, churning up the dirt, making the roads soft and treacherous. The ranch came alive with the sound of running water, new shoots pushing through the thawing ground. And with the spring came her brother. Ezekiel saw him riding up the drive, a small cloud of dust trailing behind him, even on the wet ground. The boy looked even thinner than before, his clothes more ragged. He was drunk, that was clear, swaying in the saddle, his eyes already glazed. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, a sneer twisting his face. "Heard you were keeping my sister," he slurred, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Time for her to come home. She's almost due, and I figure she owes me a cut of the harvest." He laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. Ruthie, who had been on the porch shelling peas, froze. She instinctively clutched her belly, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. She stood up, slowly, her gaze fixed on her brother. Ezekiel stepped forward, placing himself between Ruthie and the boy. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a sudden move. "She ain't going anywhere," he said, his voice flat, steady. "She's staying here." The brother's eyes narrowed. "Oh, is that so? Well, I'll just tell the sheriff you're keeping a thief then. She stole from our ma, you know, that land she's on. It's ours, really. I've got papers. I'll make sure you regret taking her in." He puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing, but the alcohol made him wobbly. Ruthie's face was white. Her hand went to her mouth, stifling a small gasp. Ezekiel saw the fear, and a cold resolve settled in his gut. "You sold her," Ezekiel said, his voice low, a quiet rumble that carried more weight than any shout. "You don't get to call her kin now." He took a step forward, just one, but it was enough. The brother flinched, then backed his horse away, muttering curses under his breath. He turned, spurred his horse, and galloped off, leaving churned mud and a lingering sense of unease in his wake. Ruthie stood trembling, watching him go, but Ezekiel didn't look at her. He just kept his gaze on the disappearing figure of the brother, a promise in his eyes. The night it started, the ranch was quiet. A thin sliver of moon hung in the sky, casting long shadows. Ezekiel was asleep, a heavy, dreamless sleep, when a low moan cut through the stillness. He was awake in an instant, his boots hitting the floor before he even knew why. He stumbled through the dark house, lighting a lantern as he went. He found Ruthie in the guest room, her face pale, her hands clutching the edges of the bed. "It's time," she whispered, her voice strained. Her breathing was quick, shallow, panic, cold and sharp, twisted in Ezekiel's gut. He was a rancher, not a midwife. He knew how to deliver a calf, sure, but a human baby? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He boiled water, as he'd heard women did. He lit every lamp in the house, pushing back the shadows, as if more light would somehow make him know what to do. The room filled with the flickering glow, the smell of lamp oil. Hours crawled by. The sounds of her labor filled the small house. The low moans, the sharp gasps, the sounds of straining. He felt useless, just holding her hand when she reached for it, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't leave," she choked out, her eyes squeezed shut, her knuckles white. He didn't. He stayed, a silent, steady presence in the storm of her pain. He offered water, wiped her brow with a damp cloth, whispered rough, awkward words of encouragement he didn't even know he had. Then, just as the first hint of false dawn painted the sky with faint pinks, a new sound filled the room. A cry. Small, reedy, but utterly unmistakable. A baby girl. Ruthie was sobbing, silent tears streaming down her face as she gathered the tiny squalling bundle into her arms. She didn't say anything, just held her tight, pressing the baby to her chest, her entire being focused on the warm new life in her arms. Ezekiel watched, his throat tight. He reached out, gently, his calloused finger touching the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around his, a surprisingly firm grip. He looked at the tiny wrinkled face, the shock of dark hair. "Looks like she's got your fight," he said, his voice rough. Ruthie looked up, her eyes red, but a soft, weary smile touched her lips. The world outside was still dark, but in that small room, bathed in lamplight, something new and fierce had been born. The next few days were a blur of new sounds and unfamiliar rhythms. The baby Miriam slept often, cried when she was hungry, and filled the house with her small, breathy sounds. Ruthie moved with a new purpose, her movements careful, protective, always hovering over the tiny bassinet Ezekiel had cobbled together from an old apple crate. He kept his distance, mostly, watching them both from the edges, making sure they had what they needed. One morning, the sun was bright and the air was crisp. Ezekiel carried the baby out to the creek, a small gurgling stream that ran through his property. It was a place he often went when he needed to think, or when he felt the heavy presence of the past. There was a flat, smooth stone there, half hidden by moss, where he had once carved his late wife's name, a quiet memory. He sat cross-legged by the stone, the baby wrapped in a thick blanket, nestled in the crook of his arm. He took out his small hunting knife, the blade glinting in the sunlight. With careful, deliberate strokes, he began to carve a new name into the soft surface of the stone, right beside the faded letters of his wife's name, Miriam. The letters were a little crooked, a little rough, but they were there. He traced them with his finger, a silent acknowledgement. Ruthie found him there, her footsteps quiet on the damp earth. She stood for a moment, watching him, then walked over and sat down beside him. She saw the stone, the freshly carved name, and her breath hitched. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just looked at the name, then at the baby, then at him. "I don't expect you to," she started, her voice a fragile whisper, "but thank you." He looked at the small, sleeping face of the baby in his arm. "She's ours now," he said, his voice low, steady, "if you want." It wasn't a question, not exactly, more like an offer, solid and unwavering. Ruthie looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something new in her eyes, not just gratitude, but a flicker of hope, of something akin to belonging. She nodded, slowly. The sun warmed their faces, the creek gurgled, and the three of them sat there, the newly carved name on the rock, a quiet testament to a future that felt, for the first time, like it might truly be their own. The quiet on the ranch didn't last. Ezekiel was mending a broken fence post one afternoon when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Two riders. It was Sheriff Brody, a man whose face held more lines of exhaustion than authority, and his deputy. Ezekiel knew why they were there. The brother, he figured, had made good on his threat. Brody dismounted, his boots heavy on the packed earth. "Ezekiel," he said, his voice flat, "got a complaint about land. Your south pasture seems like..." He held up a crumpled piece of paper. "Your Ruthie's brother says she forged some papers. Says that land was part of their father's claim, now his. Forged papers." Ezekiel knew the brother wasn't clever enough to forge anything, but he was certainly vindictive enough to try. Ezekiel wiped his hands on his trousers. "Is that so?" he said, his voice calm, giving nothing away. He walked to the house, entered, and returned with a small folded piece of paper from his desk drawer. It was the bill of sale from the trading post, the one the brother had signed, a legal document, however distasteful its content. He handed it to Brody. "He sold her," Ezekiel said, "along with all claims to her past, including any family land. She ain't his to complain about anymore." Brody read the paper, his brow furrowed. He looked up, then around, as if expecting to find someone to argue with. "Got a witness?" he asked, doubtfully. Ezekiel nodded. "The post owner. He saw it. He signed it." Just then, Ruthie stepped out onto the porch, Miriam tucked into her arm. She was wearing a clean dress, her shoulders back. She met Brody's gaze directly. "That land was never his," she said, her voice clear, steady. "He beat our mother for it, claimed it when she was too sick to fight. He only ever wanted to sell it for drink." Her eyes were resolute, fierce, even with Miriam's small head resting against her shoulder. Brody looked from Ruthie to the document, then to Ezekiel. The truth, ugly as it was, settled in the air. He sighed, rubbed his temples. "Well," he said, his shoulders slumping, "seems I've got my answer. This here looks pretty clear." He turned, motioned to his deputy. "Come on, let's go, nothing for us here." He mounted his horse, gave a curt nod, and rode off. Ruthie watched them go, her jaw tight, but a quiet strength had settled around her. She looked at Ezekiel, a silent thanks in her eyes. The ranch was safe for now. The sheriff's visit, and Ruthie's quiet defiance changed things in town. Slowly, at first people still stared. They whispered, of course, but Ruthie didn't hide anymore. She started coming into town alone, or sometimes with Ezekiel. Always, she held Miriam, the baby nestled close, a small, warm bundle against her chest. She bought supplies, picked up mail, spoke to the shopkeepers. She walked with her head held higher, her back straighter, as if the land beneath her boots was finally her own. People started seeing her, not just as that girl, the one sold by her brother, the one with a baby. They saw her as a mother. They saw her quiet strength, the way she cared for Miriam, the way she managed her small purchases, always practical, always thoughtful. They saw her in the dusty streets, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. One crisp afternoon, she was leaving the general store, Miriam asleep in her arms, when an old woman, Mrs. Gable, stopped her. Mrs. Gable was known for her sharp tongue and even sharper eyes. Ruthie braced herself, expecting a judgment, a comment about her past. But the old woman's face was soft. "You walk like you belong here, child," Mrs. Gable said, her voice raspy, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Like you've got roots." Ruthie looked at the old woman, then down at Miriam, a small smile touching her own lips. The words felt like a blessing, a quiet acknowledgement of the life she was building. "Because I do," Ruthie replied, her voice clear, firm, leaving no room for doubt. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She just walked on, her steps sure, the baby warm and safe in her arms. The wind carried her words down the street, and for the first time, people heard them not as a plea, but as a statement of quiet fact. She belonged. The smell of smoke woke Ezekiel, not the clean, comforting scent of the fireplace, but something acrid, sharp, carried on the night wind. He was out of bed, pulling on his trousers, before his mind fully registered the smell. He burst out the front door and saw it. Flames, licking at the dark sky, orange and red against the black silhouette of the barn. Someone had set fire to the barn. He ran, shouting for Ruthie, his heart pounding in his chest. She was already there, at the barn door, pulling it open, letting out the panicked horses. Miriam was in a sling on her back, quiet and bundled against the cold night air, miraculously asleep through the commotion. They worked together, a frantic, unspoken choreography. He unlatched stalls, slapped the flanks of the terrified cattle, guiding them out into the open field. Ruthie herded the goats, their bleating cries mixing with the roar of the fire. The heat was immense, a living, breathing thing. He saw her face, streaked with soot, her eyes wide, but she didn't cry. She just moved, steadily, surely, saving every animal she could. They got them all out, every last one. But as the last cow stumbled into the night, the roof of the barn groaned, then collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar, sending sparks high into the night. It was gone. The feed, the tools, the winter hay, all of it reduced to ashes. Sheriff Brody arrived just as the last flames were dying down to embers. He walked through the smoking ruins, his face grim. "Heard about your brother," Brody said, not looking at Ezekiel, just kicking at a charred beam. "Heard he's been talking. Said he'd make you regret things." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Ezekiel just nodded, watching the smoke curl into the sky. The next few weeks were hard, but the town, the same town that had whispered about Ruthie, showed up. Neighbors, men Ezekiel barely knew, arrived with hammers and saws. They brought lumber, nails, food. It was a quiet act of solidarity, no grand speeches, just strong hands and knowing nods. Ezekiel worked beside them, clearing the rubble, laying new foundations. Ruthie was there too, not crying, not complaining. Her hands, usually so gentle, were blistered, but she worked, hauling wood, fetching water, her face set in a grim determination. The barn would rise again, they would make sure of it. Time passed, as it always does. Seasons turned, years unfolded. Miriam grew. She was a sturdy child, with Ruthie's dark hair and a determined set to her chin. She learned to walk, then to run, her laughter echoing across the ranch. Ezekiel taught her to ride, first on an old pony, then on a sure-footed mare, showing her how to hold the reins, how to feel the horse beneath her. He taught her the names of the constellations, how to read the weather in the clouds. Ruthie taught her to sew, her small fingers struggling with the needle, and to read, her voice a quiet murmur as she sounded out words from an old, worn Bible. Miriam learned to help with chores, to feed the chickens, to gather eggs, her small hands surprisingly capable. They were a family, not by blood but by the quiet, steady rhythm of shared life. The ranch was home, filled with the warmth of the wood stove, the smell of Ruthie's baking, and Miriam's endless questions. One sunny afternoon, Ezekiel had taken Miriam to the general store in town. She was 6 now, a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. The schoolteacher, a kindly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, saw them. She smiled, a warm, friendly smile. "Oh, Miriam, dear," she said, bending down. "What a wonderful grandfather you have." Miriam looked at Ezekiel, then back at the teacher, a puzzled frown on her face. Before Ezekiel could say anything, before he could even think about how to respond to such a natural assumption, Ruthie, who had just walked up carrying a sack of flour, spoke. Her voice was clear, firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "That's her father," she said. Ezekiel didn't say anything. He just looked at Ruthie, then down at Miriam, who had instinctively reached for his hand. He tightened his grip on her small, warm fingers. Holding her a little closer, the teacher stammered an apology, her face colouring, but Ruthie just gave a small, polite nod. The truth, spoken simply and without fanfare, was more powerful than any explanation. Miriam was his, and Ruthie, in that moment, had ensured the whole town knew it. Years bled into one another, marked by the changing seasons and Miriam's steady growth. The ranch prospered, the new barn stood strong, life had settled into a quiet, enduring rhythm. Then, one late autumn afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Ruthie, thin and worn. It carried the faint smell of stale whiskey and a distant, nameless town. Ruthie opened it, her brow furrowed. She read it slowly, her face paling as she went. When she finished, she handed it to Ezekiel without a word. He read it. Her brother. He had died. Alone, penniless, in some forgotten gambling town. A swift, unremarked end to a hard, bitter life. Tucked inside the letter was another document, official-looking. A deed. Land rights from an uncle. Some distant relative. Land that, now by some twist of fate, belonged to Ruthie. It was a substantial piece of property, richer pasture than Ezekiel's own. He could claim it. He could sell it, make them comfortable for the rest of their lives. He looked at Ruthie. She was staring out the window, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. She still looked pale, but her eyes held a quiet resolve. "We could claim it," Ezekiel said, his voice neutral. "It would make things easier, for Miriam." Ruthie turned from the window, her gaze meeting his. There was no greed in her eyes, no longing for what might have been, only a deep, abiding certainty. "I'd rather raise her," she said, her voice steady. "On land we earned, not stole. Land built with our own hands, not taken from another's misery." She looked at the deed in his hand, then back at him. "It's tainted." Ezekiel looked at the deed, then at Ruthie's resolute face. He thought about the fire, the hard work, the quiet kindness of the town, the steady way they had built their life, stone by stone, fence post by fence post. He thought about Miriam, learning to ride, her small hand in his. He nodded, slowly. He walked to the fireplace, where a small fire crackled. Without a word, he crumpled the deed in his hand, then dropped it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, a silent and final release. Ruthie watched it burn, a small knowing smile touching her lips. Years passed. Miriam was no longer a child. She was a young woman, strong and capable, her movements graceful as she rode across the fields, helping Ezekiel with fence posts, mending fences as easily as she braided her own hair. She laughed often, a bright, clear sound that filled the ranch with joy. Ruthie would watch her from the porch, a quiet contentment settling over her face. One clear autumn afternoon, the air crisp and smelling of pine and dry grass. Ezekiel saddled 2 horses. He had not ridden far from the ranch in years. Not for pleasure. He turned to Ruthie, who was just coming out of the house with a basket of fresh eggs. "Care for a ride?" he asked, his voice low, a hint of something unsaid in the question. She looked at him, then at the horses, then back at him. She nodded, a soft smile on her lips. She put the eggs down, walked to the horse, and swung herself into the saddle with an easy grace. They rode in silence, the horses' hooves thudding softly on the dry earth. They rode higher into the hills, following a narrow, winding trail, until they reached a small, quiet clearing. It was where his first wife was buried, beneath a lone oak tree, a simple stone marking the spot. He dismounted, and Ruthie followed, leading her horse. He walked to the tree, to the stone. He had brought something with him, a small, smooth river stone he'd found by the creek that morning. He laid it gently beside the faded headstone. He didn't carve a name this time. Instead, he simply wrote a short phrase with a piece of charcoal. "Family isn't blood, it's who stays." He looked at it for a long moment, then at the sky, then at Ruthie. Ruthie stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Thank you for staying," she said, her voice soft, filled with a depth of feeling he hadn't heard before. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his life with nothing but fear and a promise, and had given him everything. "You gave me a reason to," he answered. The words hung in the still air, simple and true. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, Ezekiel, Ruthie, and the quiet, enduring spirit of the family they had built, rooted in the hard earth, growing strong beneath the vast, indifferent sky.